Today's episode is sponsored by my friends at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. The National Ranching Heritage Center on the campus of Texas Tech University tells the story of ranching in the American West through over 50 historic structures. One of those structures is the Wild Cow Corral. The Wild Cow Corral, with its trap gate, came from the Block Ranch in Capitan, New Mexico, and was built circa 1900. The old corral demonstrates how cattle were gathered in the high country, unlike the way cowboys performed the task on flat land. In the mountains, ranch hands devised a way to catch cattle by building wooden corrals among the trees, often using the trees themselves and putting feed inside the gates. Wild cattle nudged the gates to get to the feed. When the gate closed, the animals could not push it open from within. Cowboys or brush poppers gathered the cattle and used burros and horses to drag the cows down the mountain to the ranch's pens for branding. You can see the Wild Cow Corral in person at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. You can check them out online at ranchingheritage.org. Come experience real ranches, real stories, real heritage at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. I'd like to start today's show with an old-time poem by Charles Badger Clark. I'd like to dedicate this poem to today's guest who, as you will hear, shares an appreciation for the poetry of Badger Clark. This piece of Badger Clark's is entitled The Passing of the Trail. There was a sunny savage land beneath the eagle's wings, and there across the thorns and sand wild rovers rode as kings. Is it a yarn from long ago and far across the sea? Could that land be the land we know, those roving riders we? The trail's a lane, the trail's a lane. How comes it, part of mine? Within a day it slipped away and hardly left a sign. Now history a tale has gained to please the younger ears, a race of kings that rose and reigned and passed in 50 years. Dream back beyond the cramping lanes to glories that have been, the camp smoke on the sunset plains, the riders loping in, loose rein and rowelled heel to spare, the wind our only guide, for youth was in the saddle there with half a world to ride. The trail's a lane, the trail's a lane. Dead is the branding fire. The prairies wild are tame and mild, all close corralled with wire. The sunburnt demigods who ranged and laughed and lived so free have topped the last divide or changed to men like you and me. Where, in the valley fields and fruits, now hums a lively street, we milled a mob of fighting brutes among the grim mesquite. It looks a far and fearful way, the trail from now to then. But time is telescoped today 100 years and 10. The trail's a lane, the trail's a lane. Our brows are scarcely seamed, but we may scan a mighty span Methuselah ne'er dreamed. Yet, partner, we are dull and old, with paltry hopes and fears, besides those rovers gay and bold, far riding down the years. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Linda Davis. Linda is a fourth-generation rancher who grew up working on her family's Tequesquite Ranch, as well as the historic Bell Ranch, where her father, Albert Mitchell, was the ranch manager. Linda has spent her life on the 148-year-old CS Ranch in northeastern New Mexico, and her family continues to operate the CS Ranch. She has received the Woman of the West Award from Western Horseman magazine and the Golden Spur Award from the National Ranching Heritage Center. In 1995, Linda was inducted into the Cowgirl Hall of Fame, and in 2000, Linda and her husband, Les Davis, were inducted into the Hall of Great Westerners at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. I sat down with Linda at her home on the CS Ranch and recorded this interview. Here's Linda Davis.
Actually, I was raised down in Harding County below Mascaro, below the Cap Rock there at Mascaro. I don't know how you came today, but the little town of Mascaro, we were about 18 miles from that in the Tequesquite Valley. And I was raised on this Tequesquite Ranch, which was founded by my great-grandfather and my dad's father, and then my dad continued in the management of it. So I was raised down there on the east side of New Mexico. And my mother died when I was 4 years old. She was New Mexico's first public health nurse. And she became, right after the First World War, and her territory was the state of New Mexico, and she had to give a health examination to every school child that was registered in that would be 1920, 21, And so she drove herself around. This was before there were paved roads or anything else. And she was not a very big person. She wore a size 6 quad A shoe, which is quite a narrow shoe for a woman. And she would drive herself, change her own tires. In those days, you got a flat tire every time you took the car out of the garage. And she was an amazing person. She really was. Unfortunately, she died after my youngest brother was born. And so my dad was left with 3 children. I was the oldest that survived. I had an older brother that didn't survive, and then I was next. And then my brother Tommy was third, and my brother Albert was the 4th one of the children that lived any time. And we were raised down there, and I went to a homeschooling unit called Calvert School that was headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland, but sent us books and things like that. It was for people that were preaching the gospel out all over the world. You could get this Calvert
missionaries.
School system, yes, and missionaries and things like that. And so I was raised in school down there till about the 6th grade. And then the Second World War came along, and we were all of us on the ranches. My dad was running the Bell Ranch then, and his own ranch, and everybody was part of the war effort during the Second World War. And so my dad got us in a school in Albuquerque that would go just 4 days a week, and then we could go home and punch cows the rest of the day. Because we even, kids any age, if you could ride a horse and head a calf, you were considered a member of the crew. And so I started pretty young working with the Bell Ranch Cowboys and the Tequesquite Ranch Cowboys. So all my life, I guess I've been in the ranching business.
I've read about some of your memories working with those Bell Ranch cowboys
Well,
and
they were wonderful cowboys. They were, as I say, it was kind of during the war, and a lot of them were physically not able to be inducted into the Army, but they were great hands, so we and us youngsters tried to help each other out, and so it was either a more elderly crew or a young bunch of youngsters, and we learned pretty darn early that about as I say, during the Second World War, there were so many restrictions, rationing and things like that, and so most everything we did was horseback. And so it was, because gasoline was if you had a tank of gasoline, you were a privileged character, because it was all rationed during the war years. It was a great area to be in. It's pretty isolated. It's between, the state line there and this way, about a great area to be raised in.
did I read somewhere that you learned how to read by spending time with some of those cowboys on the Bell Ranch?
Well, the cowboys, yes. The ranch romances was every cowboy had a paperback copy of Ranch Romance in his bedroll, and it had nice big print, and they taught me how to read. I could read, just as soon as I could hold up a thing, they started teaching me the ABCs and and they were exciting. I mean, it was not just the average see Jane, see Jane, or see, the regular reading book that you had. It was great reading, and I could read quite young. The cowboys, we'd try and rotate these ranch romance books through everybody, or I should say paperbacks. It was a great education, and I was privileged to work with a group of dedicated cowboys. Well, the wagon boss on the Bell Ranch was Mark Woods, and he was a fantastic person. He not very big, not very tall, but he was a man of few words. But when he said something, boy, you listened. You didn't. It didn't. Was Mark Woods, and then Yaki Tatum was the segundo there on the Bell. We had two brothers that on the Tequesquite Ranch, which was my dad's family ranch, and where I was raised, actually. And we had the two Romero brothers, and they were both fantastic cowboys and horse breakers. And so no, there's been, Fred was one of them, and what was the other one's name? Maybe I'll remember it. It was Fred Romero and Juan Romero. So the number one rule was never scream. That was they said it hurts the horse's ears and their ears and the cow's ears, and don't scream. And boy, I was raised that way. I've never, they just didn't like to have, I was a rare female with a wagon crew, and that was, as I say, that was the number one rule. You never scream unless it's an absolute emergency. And so I learned a long time ago to keep my voice down.
Were there other rules or etiquette around the wagon?
Oh, well, yes. Well, you treated your horses right. You treated respect, and the cowboys were always older, and you let them get their coffee first. And everybody in the morning, we'd get up and eat breakfast, and and wash our dishes in the tub the cook had set up, put everything back, and then we'd go out and listen and sing out our horses on the remuda. And we always had Ralph Bonds was the segundo, and he always roped your horse out, and you'd call the name of your horse, and he'd rope and bring it out, and you'd stand there and get your bridle on the horse and lead him out and get saddled. And as soon as everybody got saddled, we'd gather around Mark, and he'd tell us what area of the ranch we were going to gather that day, and where we were going to have the branding, and what we were going to do each morning. It was a pretty, and that was with the wagon crew. They had a fence crew on the Bell too, but it worked out of the headquarters, and we worked out of the chuck wagon, wherever it was moved to or had been. And it usually started the 1st of June and went through depending on what progress we made and what the weather was. We'd usually be back to the headquarters by August, sometimes late August, sometimes mid-August, depending on. And then we'd be based out of the bunkhouse at the Bell Ranch headquarters. Or if we were with the crew at Tequesquite, we'd be working with the crew at headquarters.
In an interview with Western Horseman magazine in January of 2020, Linda Davis said this: "I cowboyed all my life. When I was 5, I became part of the Bell Ranch crew. I worked with the cowboys there and on the Tequesquite. My dad said, if you can do things well and complete a task, you won't have any problem."
Then the older I got, lots of times, if we had a green crew, I'd take a couple of them with me and try and tell them the names of the pastures and where the water was and things like that, so you could locate your herds. And of course, so much of that was in the warriors, and all of the ranches in this area were under contract to the military to provide beef for the soldiers. And so it was a great education, I must say, with a great group of dedicated people, because people's purpose during the Second World War, we were all focused on winning the war. And then, so it was a interesting time to be, we worked hard, but there was never any complaining. Everybody had the same mission. I had 2 younger brothers that I had one brother, the middle brother, the one that was closest to my age, died of leukemia when he was 7 years old. So I lost one. Then I had my youngest brother was 4 years younger than I, and my mother died after he was born. So Albert and I were kind of raised on the ranch. When he got big enough to stay on top of a horse, away we'd go. And my dad had some registered cows that we had to check practically every day. And so we learned at a young age, we learned to teach our horses, take our rope and make a loop, and when we had to close these barbed wire gates, pull it tight, and our horses got to where they knew exactly. They'd watch us and they knew when they had to step back. It was amazing to realize the intelligence, animal intelligence, that are available in both horses and cows, and I guess all animals are that way because they've survived this long.
Your father must have been an amazing man and must have had a tremendous influence on you.
Yes, he was, because he was left raising, 3 children. He had 3. I say we lost my brother when he was 7 years old. So my next younger sibling was, and we lost him. But my dad raised Albert and I, and he used to take us with him. We'd go to Amarillo to the quarter horse build. That was when they decided to have the quarter horse headquarters in Amarillo. And we went to Amarillo with my dad. He'd take us so that we could see what's going on, and he was so interested in the industry, in both the horse industry and the cattle industry and everything related to the cattle industry. And he, as I say, there's not a lot of men that would take 2 under 10-year-old children with them to a business meeting. And boy, we learned to sit still and be quiet and listen. But he took us with it, and he provided a fine education for us. And my brother and I both went to Cornell, and that was and still is a great school.
And that was in New York?
Yes, upstate New York, Ithaca, New York.
What was that experience like for you growing up out on these New Mexico ranches and then going back east?
I had a couple of years in a private girls' school in Connecticut for my junior and senior year in high school. And because my dad figured we'd never get in coming from a homeschool situation. We'd never be able to get. And so I had a couple of years that I was at a girls' boarding school, and then I went from there to Cornell because having been raised out at the ranch and with different teacher, people sort of supervising, I didn't have a good solid basic education, getting regular first grade through 8th grade. I hadn't had anything like that. I'd just gone through a correspondence course, more or less, from the Calvert system. Was headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland. And a lot of missionary children and things like that got their certification for high school through the Calvert system. Let's see, I was chasing my brother. I guess I was probably 10 or 11 years old, something like that. I was born in 1930, July of 1930, and I think this was 1940 or 41. It was in the afternoon. My brother and I were playing out in the backyard of my grandmother's house there on the Tequesquite Ranch, and I was chasing him. And it was during August when the snakes shed their skin. Rattlesnakes do, and it goes off. They shed the covering of their eyes and things like that first, and then it works back down them, and then as they crawl off, they leave. The last thing is the tail, the where the rattles are. And this snake had crawled through his hide, his shed off hide, and we couldn't hear the rattles because it was over. They were being suppressed by the dried skin. And my brother kicked this, and it was we had some grass, and we didn't really see it. And I was chasing him, and he was kicked it, and then the snake struck me, and on the inside of the left ankle here. And my grandmother was the only person at the ranch then, and she didn't drive, and we had a bunkhouse cook that could drive, and my grandmother had a car, but someone always drove her, and he drove us, and we finally got to a doctor in Springer, New Mexico, which was about well over 100 miles from Tequesquite. So I was in the hospital for a little while till that started healing.
It has sometimes been debated if the old-time cowboys actually sang to the cattle on night guard. But most historical accounts seem to back up that idea. Here's a quote from old-time cowboy Teddy Blue Abbott. "One reason I believe there are so many songs about cowboys was the custom we had of singing to the cattle on night herd. The singing was supposed to soothe them, and it did." And another cowboy writer, Raymond Adams, once wrote that the practice of singing to cattle on bedground got to be so common that night herding was spoken of as singing to them.
On night herd, sometimes you would. In general, cowboys that I was around, there was a lot of Hispanics, and sometimes they'd sing at night and all when you're holding curse. So many times we would ride all night, holding a herd of cows, getting ready to brand early the next morning. And it was just part of the job. I didn't. And, my dad always had a copy of Sun and Saddle Leather, was put together by a man by the name of Badger Clark. And my dad always felt it was the best book of poetry about real cowboys. And he always had a copy of this with him, and he always felt that Badger Clark knew what he was writing about. My dad always knew cowboys and did the best, and you can tell this is my copy, and I have given it a hard time because I've used it a lot.
Do you recall if your father had a favorite piece out of that book?
Oh, well, he liked the whole book. Yeah, I don't think he would tell you which one he liked the best. It was the best written Western poetry book, in his opinion. That's about all I can tell you. At this point, I was raised with one of these, my dad just really believed in this little book, Sun and Saddle Leather. You see, this was a Christmas present to me way back when, and he always had some of Badger Clark's books, and he'd give them to, if people were really interested, he'd give them a copy of it.
Linda Davis has had a lifelong passion for good ranch horses, and in the year 2000, the CS Ranch received the Best Remuda Award from the American Quarter Horse Association. When I hear Linda talk about horses, it reminds me of the first stanza from Will Ogilvy's poem, The Hooves of the Horses. The hooves of the horses, so witching and sweet, is the music earth steals from the iron-shod feet. No whisper of lover, no trilling of bird can stir me as hooves of the horses have stirred.
I have a long list. A list is probably as long as my arm at wonderful ranch horses that I rode, was able to ride. We had, my brother and I had two horses that we rode when we were very small. And everywhere I went, we had great horses because the Bell was very conscious. That's when my dad was running the Bell. And they were founding the quarter, and they had all these wonderful mares that had been range mares, and they were bred to good studs. And really, these range mares produced some of the best remudas. And we had a remuda on the Tequesquite and one on the Bell. And so many of these mares, when were produced a good cow pony every year. They were amazing strain of horses that, and the Bell Ranch had been was owned at that point by a group of investors that were actually the trustees at Yale University, but they loved to come west in those days back then, and so some of them brought good stallions from Europe or from England, and they exposed them to these range bred mares, and we had a wonderful remuda on the Bell and on the Tequesquite. Just great cow ponies, and each ranch had a good broodmare band. So I've been privileged all my life to ride some good horses.
We're sitting here right now at your home on the CS Ranch. Could you tell me about the history of this place and how it came to be a part of your life here?
Well, the CS Ranch was established in 1873, 22nd of February, 1873. And Frank Springer was the land grant lawyer this was the Maxwell land grant, this whole northeastern section of New Mexico. And Tequesquite is 100 miles from here toward the county line southeast of here. My dad's best friend was Ed Springer, who was my husband's uncle and Les's uncle, and they were best of friends. So Les used to come out. Les was raised in Philadelphia. His father was a renowned reconstructive surgeon, the first person during the First World War that started doing people that had their ears shot off or were wounded seriously, transplanting bone and all. And so Les was raised in Philadelphia, but his mother was a Springer. And she had been raised here in this area on the ranch and in Las Vegas. She graduated from college in Las Vegas and then went on to Columbia. But the ranch has been in the family since, as I say, since 1873. It's been in the Springer family. And my husband's mother was a Springer. Frank Springer had 7 children, and he had 3 boys and 4 girls. So that was kind of the story there. And so this ranch was a well-known ranch, and my dad, for years, his good friend Ed Springer, who was my husband's uncle, had been in the First World War, and so he never got the ranching experience. He'd been in the military from the time he was out of high school, and he never really learned the ranching business. So my dad would come and help him select his bulls, for instance, and things like that. And because Uncle Ed wasn't really a judge of what one needed to improve the breed and to get the right kind of bulls, but my dad was always very helpful that way, because he had an eye for good livestock. So that's kind of how the CS, after Les was discharged from the Army, was in the Second World War, and when he was discharged from the Army after he came back, he wrote his uncle and said, "I'd like to come out to the ranch and learn the ranching business." He said, that's what I want to do now that I'm out of the military. And so he came out here, and Uncle Ed told him to come out and learn the business. And so he and Uncle Ed had come down to the Tequesquite Ranch where I was raised, and we kind of got acquainted that way. And Les graduated in 1941 from Dartmouth College. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor was December 7th of 41, and he went into the military as immediately after Pearl Harbor. And that was the 7th of December of 41. And so he was gone all during the war years. He went across Europe with Patton's 4th Armored. And so when he came back from the service, I was in college, and we just started going together, I guess you might say.
Was it difficult for him to adapt to the ranching business?
He loved the ranch. He always did. He'd come out here during his summer breaks, from high school, and he'd come out here, and he loved this area of New Mexico. And I think his folks several times drove cross country, and they saw all kinds of different parts of the country, and he said this was still the best he knew. So,
what is it about this area that's so conducive to raising cattle?
Well, it's the edge of the Great Plains, and it's grassland, and I think that's the one reason. And it backs right up to the mountains. You have to have cattle that can take this elevation, because we're pretty high here, and you bring cattle from these yearlings that they bring in the summertime from Florida. They have a tough time adjusting to the elevation. So that's one of the reasons, as I say, the edge of the Great Plains is the southern tier of the Rocky Mountains. And so that's the mountains between here and Taos. Oh yes, we had a wonderful cow foreman by the name of Jiggs Porter, and he had a younger brother that worked for the ranch also, and they were both good hands with horses and top-notch cowboys, and good. You call them a cowman too, because they could go through a herd and pick out. Jiggs and Raymond Porter were two outstanding employees of the ranch here. We had a wonderful foreman on this end of the ranch by the name of Cale Wheatley, and he was born and raised in the Clayton area, and came here as a young man. He had been injured he'd been badly burned in a gasoline can when he was in school. I don't know what really happened, but he had a lot of scars, and he came to this part of the world because I think where he was raised over near Clayton, everybody knew him, and I think felt sorry for him, and he came here and really established himself. He was our foreman on this end of the ranch for many, many years. He and his wife were wonderful people. We have the Crow Creek division of the ranch. That's toward Raton. It's about, 20 miles from Cimarron? Something like that, toward Raton. Jiggs ran that division of the ranch for a long time, and Cale Wheatley ran this division, was our foreman here. So we've had some outstanding cowboys through the years. Cattlemen, you want to call them a combination cattleman and cowboy, because they could pick out good cows. We've been very lucky.
The CS Ranch is now 148 years old, and amazingly, it has been in the same family all of those years. In the year 2000, Linda's husband Les Davis said this: "Our kids have all picked this up by second nature. They all voluntarily came back to the ranch. The subject of, 'You've got to come back and help us run this place,' never came up."
Well, I must say that they're 6 amazing young people, and they get along, and they enjoy each other, and they like the ranch. I mean, they love the ranch. Each one of them is a gifted person, as an individual, but they get along and they help each other out, and that's the basis of the crew here, is the children. I'm not able to do what I used to do, but they pitch in, get ready to brand, and the whole works has gone ahead. The heads for wherever we're having the branding on the ranch. So I'm very proud of my children, and I'm very proud of each individual one. They're good citizens, good parents, good people to be around, and I'm very fortunate to have 6 wonderful children, and then I have quite a bunch of great-grandchildren. So I have to stop and think and count noses, in places, and remember. I don't remember the way I used to remember.
As mentioned previously, Linda Davis received the prestigious Golden Spur Award from the National Ranching Heritage Center in 1992. And her father, Albert Mitchell, was the very first recipient of the Golden Spur Award in 1978. Both Linda and her father were instrumental in the founding of the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City, and Linda continues to have a deep interest in preserving Western heritage and culture.
Well, I was involved in the beginning of the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City, and also in Lubbock, the Ranching Heritage Center there. My dad was the first honoree there, and I went down and I met him at the airport and drove him in, and we were there for the dedication of the Lubbock Ranching Heritage Association. And then my dad was instrumental in getting the first funds together for the National Cowboy Museum in Oklahoma City. And they flew all over the West to selecting a location. And the 7 western states were asked to offer a site for the, and the site in Oklahoma City was the one that won the approval of the trustees that were there then. And so my dad got involved in that when he was already involved. he was had great interest in Western history and presented correctly and honestly. And he got involved in some of these institutions that have turned out to be wonderful places.
And why do you think that's important, this preservation of Western history and heritage and presenting it to the public?
I think it's important because the organizations that are running now haven't let themselves get glitzy or too off. They're dishonest in presenting the Western cowboy and the symbol that the West was. I mean, it's wonderful to live in a part of the world where we don't have some of the problems that the cities do. And the children that are raised in cities, I think we're very fortunate. Well, I guess it's because what I have known all, and I've been exposed. I was fortunate. I went back to Cornell University, and I've always been interested in agriculture, and we're feeding the world is what we're doing, and I've been a great advocate of agriculture and agricultural innovation and anything that's because I think our world population is gaining. If we don't have the good basics of agriculture and food, we're going to end up 100 years from now starving to death, if we get carried. So I'm a great advocate of agriculture. I've had an exciting, interesting life and been very fortunate to have been raised in the area I am and my children. And Les came back from the military service and we started going together, and he was a wonderful person, and I was very fortunate we had a very happy marriage. And I've got 6 wonderful kids and grandchildren, and I have no complaints. I'm very fortunate. We have drought years, but if that's our biggest challenge, we've managed to overcome it and plan right, use the land right, and take care of the land. So I'm very fortunate to have lived in the day and age and where I am. I think the technology that's been improved, the improvement in animal health, and I think I'm very lucky to have lived in the decades I've lived in and seen the progress that has come from, our big problem on the ranch years and years ago when I was little was screwworms, and it was the flies that, would lay the little maggots. And my first job in the branding corral was to follow the man around with a we dehorned the steer calves then, and put a dab of creosote or something on the little scar things. I mean, times have changed, and all of them change has been for the good, I think. I think modern agriculture has made great steps. I'm fortunate to have lived in the era that I've lived in. I'm 90 years old now, so I've seen a lot of change in that time, and I think I'm very lucky to have lived in the era that I have lived in. I look back and think of all the good friends and the friendships through the years. I've been involved in the cattle business and here all my life, and I think of so many wonderful people that are part of it. So I think I've been very fortunate.
Well, Miss Davis, thank you for taking the time to do this and for allowing me to come into your home and
Well, I appreciate your coming here. As I say, I can't get around much anymore, but I enjoy having somebody come see me, and I enjoyed visiting with you very much, and thank you for being here.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Linda Davis for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Linda and the CS Ranch at cscattle.com. I'd like to thank the National Ranching Heritage Center for sponsoring this episode. You can find out more about the National Ranching Heritage Center at ranchingheritage.org. I'd like to thank my Trail Boss patron, Bob Kelly. If you're enjoying the podcast and would like to help keep it going, you can become a patron at patreon.com/cowboycrossroads. That's patreon.com/cowboycrossroads. You can also make a donation on my website at andyhedges.com. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.